I'm Rob Vischer. Welcome to my storytelling podcast, God Out Loud. With every new episode, you'll hear thought-provoking stories of people who claim they heard God. Today, you'll hear from Isaiah Kallman, a guy who claims God told him to go to Waffle House. If you want to hear more God Out Loud stories, follow God Out Loud now on your favorite podcast app. The year was 2013. The exact day, I don't really remember. But on that day, instead of turning on the radio in our silver Pontiac Sunfire, my wife and I opened up a book called Stark Raving Obedience. The book was written by Ted and Isaiah Kallman, a father and son duo who are also the dad and brother of one of our best friends, Etta Woods. The book's narrative launches with a weirdly wild story about a mid-Michigan woman who was driving home one day and heard an internal voice say, "Stop in the 7-Eleven and go stand on your head next to the pop machine." For obvious reasons, she didn't want to do it, and she passed the 7-Eleven and continued toward her home. Then the nudge returned, but this time with more urgency. Go back to the 7-Eleven and stand on your head next to the pop machine. I tracked down Isaiah Kallman, one of the authors. I'll let him read what happened next.
She turned her car around and parked in front of the 7-Eleven. There were no other cars. At least no one would stare at her, she thought. When she entered, she saw a young man standing behind the counter, and the woman wished that he would go into the back room to stock some things. She walked over next to the soda machine, stood on her head, and nothing happened. Weren't the heavens supposed to have torn open to the sound of angel choirs singing because she obeyed? What gives? The woman began to walk out, and the young man behind the counter stopped her. "Excuse me, why did you just do that?" Okay, so how does one explain this in a spiritually relevant way? Yes, I was driving home, communing with the God of the universe, the maker of all heaven and earth, and he said to me, "O woman of faith and power, go thou to the 7-Eleven and stand upon thy head by the soda machine." And does that sound normal? Does it sound sane? Does it even sound like God? No, it sounds stupid. She told him to please just forget about it. "I'm sorry to have bothered you. I'm a little embarrassed. I think I'll just leave." He insisted. "No, wait. I have to know why you did that." Then he pulled a gun out from under the counter. "A few minutes ago, I had this in my mouth. My life isn't worth living, and I was going to kill myself. At the last moment, I gave God one more chance. I said, 'God, if you're real, why don't you send somebody in here and have them stand on their head by the soda machine? So I really need to know why you did that. Could you tell me about your God?'"
When I initially reached out to Isaiah, I wanted to find this female corner store gymnast. After all, she has the perfect God Out Loud story. But when I asked if he knew how to contact the pop machine acrobat, he said he didn't. His dad told him the story pre-2006, and Isaiah couldn't remember her name. Neither could any of his siblings. Isaiah doesn't doubt this upside-down story, though, but it isn't because he's naive, impressionable, or gullible, or even a liar. He actually strikes me as quite the opposite of all those. I might describe him as a friendly punk rock-rooted skeptic with dark-rimmed glasses, skinny jeans, and genuine intellectual curiosity. In other words, he seems like a pretty smart guy. Despite his friendly skepticism, though, he believes this story happened because, well, you'll find out.
In the early 90s, my dad was clinically depressed. He and my mom were having troubles, and my brothers were unmanageable, perfect agents of chaos and malice and horror. Things were just not good.
Not good? For Isaiah, that's quite the understatement. As a child, he not only lived under the burdens of a strained home life, school didn't provide any escape. Instead of the life lessons of Full House or the comedy of Saved by the Bell, this is what he remembers most about the early 90s.
I was physically assaulted a minimum of 3 times a week for about 5 years. In 5th grade, 3 kids beat me unconscious on the playground. My 5th grade teacher wrote on my report card, "Pull him out. He's not going to survive the middle school."
Isaiah's dad was a respected man in his community. He faithfully attended church and even served on boards of multiple nonprofits. But his older sons were constantly tangled in trouble. Isaiah was barely surviving bullies, Ted's marriage was strained to say the least, and Ted was quickly sinking into a deep depression.
He spoke to a friend of his who brought to him the concept of listening prayer. My dad hears a couple of stories about people who sat and listened for the voice of God. And my dad was like, I spent my entire life in the church. I have never known God like that. He was really desperate and sat down at his desk in his office and said, I'm not leaving here until I hear from you. And he put down a pad of paper and a pen, and he just sat there annoyed because nothing was happening. And he said that sitting there in quiet, the first thought that struck him was the phrase, I love you. His own father had never said those words to him. And he felt the fatherly love of God wash over him. And he just wept at his desk. That lit a fire in him where suddenly this is just the most important thing, his relationship with God. Sitting there in quiet, seeking out the intimacy and waiting to hear his voice. That was his daily routine from then on. And things started to change for him. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, and he did a lot of work apologizing to my mother, apologizing to us. He then started having the family an hour a day on Sundays after church, praying together as a family, and then sharing the stuff that we had written down during that period of quiet.
Isaiah's younger sister, Etta, sat down with me and reminisced about Kallman family prayer times.
I was 7 when we started praying together as a family, and it was like natural to me because I got saved really young and started praying on my own. So it wasn't weird to me. I remember my brothers, who were a lot older than me, they were like, this is weird. Why are we doing this? What are you getting us into, Dad? And they were much more resistant to it. My dad could make them sit in the room, but he couldn't make them pray, and they usually all just went to sleep.
Although the prayer times didn't always go perfectly, Ted's kids could see the results.
We found that there was a lot of encouragement coming from that. There were times that we felt a sense of warning and changed our plans accordingly, only to find out, oh, we avoided disaster. Stuff like that just kept happening.
Ted was praying and listening. His family was praying and listening. And even though the memories of warnings, encouragements, and divine interventions still linger with Isaiah, I think the memory of a 7-year-old girl might show the real miracle.
I would pray, I'd have my little pad of paper, and I'd be like, all right, what are you saying to me, Holy Spirit? And as a little kid, I usually got pictures. I wouldn't get like words. And I don't know if it was always hearing from Holy Spirit. I think my parents just wanted me to practice. And my dad was really good. He never would sit there and critique like, oh, that was God, that wasn't God. He would just be really encouraging about whatever little picture I shared. And he would like write it down in his journal and pray about it later, which at the time I felt very validated by. I was like, oh, he's writing it down. Look at me.
Over time, my dad was asked to tell people about his experiences in listening prayer. And he began to do a lot of teaching and speaking at different churches around the state of Michigan. And it got to a point where he was teaching so regularly. People were asking if there was a book, and he always talked about writing a book, but never did.
Fast forward to 2002. Ted is speaking at churches without a book, and Isaiah is dropping out of college because he has no money.
And I moved back to my parents' house because what else was I going to do? I was depressed, and I was working a job at a gas station, and I was helping to pay my parents' mortgage. And my dad really wanted me to have a project to work on because he could see how bummed I was. And he said, would you help me to write this book? So I took all of his boxes and boxes of research and transcripts and stuff, and then I wrote a book out of it. So I was 23 years old when we finished it, and we self-published it. I guess it was about a year or so later, one of the people that we quoted in that book reached out to us. And I said, if this is about the clearance for your quote, I got a letter from your office. I'm sorry. I hope you're not mad. And he said, oh, I'm not calling to complain. I'm calling to see if you'd consider letting my publishing company print your book. So that's how we got Stark Raving Obedience. Writing that book, I began to have a daily routine of listening prayer myself. And there were times that I felt like I heard God say something that seemed ridiculous. And then I would do the thing that I thought I was supposed to do out of an attitude of obedience. Sometimes I didn't see any results. And sometimes it was weird. And sometimes it felt borderline catastrophic in terms of how the other person received the word or the help that I offered. But sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it was amazing and unexplainable.
Much like Isaiah's dad, before listening prayer, Isaiah felt purposeless and depressed. After he and his dad wrote a book about the radical results of listening prayer, he tried it. And it might just be a correlation and not a cause, but Isaiah felt more purpose and less depressed.
I had a community of people in Grand Rapids, Michigan that I loved, and I felt love and support from them too. I worked at a really cool venue. I was in a band that was on the brink of some kind of success. We had just been named one of the top 10 best unsigned artists in America by a Condé Nast magazine called Jane. I finished a tour and I took my cut and I got in my car and I was just driving around the country, crashing on people's couches and being by myself and trying to get my head straight. I was just drifting, trying to figure out what to do with my life. I was passing through Nashville. I didn't know anybody here, so I slept in a parking lot. And when I woke up, I had this very strong sense of a warm and powerful presence. So I was like, okay, it feels like God's in the car with me, I guess. And so I said, what is it that you want to say? And I just sat in total silence with my notebook out. The message that I heard was, you've written this book about listening prayer. Is this something that you are going to live, or are you just going to talk about it when you're selling something? I felt thoroughly chastised, but okay. Yeah, I'm going to dedicate my life to listening to God and doing whatever I feel like he tells me to do, no matter how weird or crazy it gets. A week or so later, I'm back in Grand Rapids. And one day, in a time of prayer, I felt like I heard God say, I want you to move to Nashville. I've been wrong enough to know better than to walk upstairs and tell my parents I'm moving. I'm going to need some proof. I'm going to need something to confirm that this is really what I should be doing. And I had 7 names of different men come to mind. And over the course of the next week or so, I talked with each one of those guys. And each one of those guys said, I think you should move to Nashville. There was even one guy that says, I've been waiting for you to have this conversation with me for months.
Isaiah says God plus 7 trusted men told him, move to Nashville. If I was convinced God and 7 men told me to do anything, I'd definitely do the same thing Isaiah did.
I packed up all my stuff and gave away whatever I couldn't. And I drove down and I put all my possessions in a storage unit because the first month was $10. And then I hugged my parents and waved goodbye to them in a parking lot downtown. It's one of the only 2 times I ever saw my Finnish father cry. My parents were dropping me off in a town that neither of us knew, and I had no connections and no place to stay. I didn't have any friends. I didn't have any social engagements. I didn't have any plans. But being alone, I had a lot of time on my hands, and I certainly felt a sense of desperation. And so every morning I would sit and listen, just see if I got some sort of direction, and then go about my day based on whatever I felt like I was supposed to do that day. My first 2 weeks, I was going into churches or hanging out near college campuses or going to coffee shops, just introducing myself to strangers. And what's really cool about a town like Nashville, well, at least at the time, there was a lot of open-hearted, welcoming, friendly attitudes from people to complete strangers. Very few people in Nashville started conversations by saying, "What do you do?" Most people would ask me, "What brought you to town?" I'm a terrible liar. So I would say, I felt like God told me to move here. But I didn't want to impose on anybody's generosity. I feel like that's the worst way to get to know somebody, is to live off of them for a couple of weeks. So at a certain point in time, I still had a little bit of money left from the band, and I really didn't want to sleep in my car. So I found this extended stay hotel that was like $170 a week over by the airport. And I moved in there. I felt like that was the spot. that I was supposed to go to. And I remember looking at it and thinking, this is the hotel where I'm supposed to stay. This is where I'm supposed to live, Lord. This place is a dump. And yet I had promised to do whatever I felt like God told me to do, no matter how weird or crazy it got. So I checked myself in.
Although Isaiah had grown up in a decently clean and orderly household, in his early 20s, he had toured with a band, slept on couches, and even lived out of his car.
Did I mention that I was homeless before I moved down?
And he had been homeless.
I was living in an empty storefront in downtown Grand Rapids for a little over a year.
Even though Isaiah experienced some, shall we say, unique living situations, he still wasn't prepared for life in a cheap, extended stay hotel.
I'm on the second floor. It's balcony access, sort of like motel style, where you have the walkway. The first thing that I noticed when I opened the door is how it just smells like urine and cigarette smoke. And when I set my bags down and I put my hand on the little like kitchenette table for stabilization, when I pulled my hand up, it was sticky. There were like black oil streaks over all the towels and washcloths. And the first thing I did when I got in that room was accidentally clog the toilet. There's no plunger, so I'm going to go to the office and see if the office has a plunger. But I can't get out of my door because this couple's having a fist fight just on the other side of it. So I just had to sit on my bed and listen to them fight until they moved out of the way, and then I can go and get a plunger. I never saw what was underneath that comforter. I just rolled my sleeping bag out on the top of the bed, just slept in my sleeping bag. I emptied out probably 6 canisters of Glade air freshener in there, didn't do anything. Went to Kroger and got my own cleaning supplies. Cleaned my own hotel room for 2 weeks. My only social time while I lived there was going to this Waffle House that shared a parking lot. It was like around the corner on the block if you were driving around, but the parking lot's connected. And so I'd walk over there and I'd sit and I would read and I would pray and have hash browns and go back to my room to be sad there. After 2 weeks of this very glum routine, I had met up with some people that I knew sort of loosely from Michigan. They had moved to town to go to school. They were looking for a roommate, and it just so happened that I was going to be able to make that happen.
After 2 weeks of cozying up in his sleeping bag to avoid exploring what's underneath the comforter, to Isaiah, any decent and stable housing seemed like an extreme home makeover. Isaiah quickly repacked his few belongings and got ready to say goodbye, because some goodbyes are really meant to be forever.
I go to the office to check out, and I feel a sense of freedom from this place that is palpable. Joy is springing anew in my heart, and it's starting to rain, and it doesn't even bother me. I got all my stuff in the car before any of it got too wet. And I'm about to drive to my storage unit, and I get to the stoplight, and before I can even turn the corner, this really powerful thought hits my head and says, you need to turn into the Waffle House parking lot. I had been so alone for so long, praying and sitting and listening, that I trusted in that split second that God was trying to tell me something. Pull into the Waffle House parking lot. So I thought, well, maybe my bike is loose on the rack or something. So I pull into the parking lot. I jump out. I check my bike. All the straps are tight. Everything's fine. Well, I don't know what that was about, but I'm getting rained on. So I'm about to jump back in the car when this woman runs up to me. She's wearing pajamas. Her hair is up in this messy bun. She's carrying a backpack, and she's clearly been crying. And she says, can you please take me to the bus station downtown? And I said, sure, hop in.
I'm sure you'd like to hop into the rest of Isaiah's story right now. But like Isaiah has practiced so many times already, you'll have to sit, wait, and listen until after this short break. When we left Isaiah, he was standing outside his car in the rain by a Waffle House. A young woman in PJs approaches him and asks,
can you please take me to the bus station downtown? And I said, sure, hop in. Now I have this stranger who's shaking, quietly crying in my car, just saying, thank you so much. And in my head, I'm like, all right, God, what's this all about then? I start to get a picture sort of painted for me of what this person is going through. I don't know how much of this is sort of like how I was raised and the prejudices I had, but it just felt like, okay, something's up. This feels like drugs are involved, or I don't know. And I also got the sense that like this person's name was Sarah, which I thought was weird, and that this person just needed to get away from somebody bad and to go home. All of this sort of downloads into my head over the course of a couple of seconds. And then I turn onto 24 West to head to the city, and I hit bumper to bumper traffic. So now I'm stuck in the car with this strange young woman. And I said, "Where are you headed from the bus station?" And she says, "I'm going to go back home to Michigan." And I said, "Oh, wild. I'm from Michigan. What brought you to Nashville?" I'd been asked that question so many times in the month leading up, it just felt like this is what the locals do. I don't know. She tells me that she was visiting her boyfriend who's in the military, and they got into some kind of fight. And on her way back, her bus stopped in Nashville, and she met up with some people that were into some bad stuff, and she got mixed up with them and lied to her parents and said there was something wrong with like losing her luggage, which doesn't make sense to me considering it was a bus. But she had lied to them and said that she was stuck in Nashville, and she was really just like living with this drug dealer. After a couple of weeks, regret starts to sink in, and she wants to leave. To hear her tell it, this guy beat her up and said, "If you try to leave again, I'm going to kill you." So she waited until she was able to wake up first one morning, and she put whatever she could grab into that backpack and didn't even change, and snuck out of the house and ran down the street and stood in this Waffle House parking lot just praying something's going to happen. Help me. Just that kind of thing. And that's when I pulled in.
While listening to her story, Isaiah not only heard the reason why it was important for him to go to the Waffle House, he also heard what was downloaded into his head about this girl being verified detail by detail as she told him her story. The only detail she hadn't verified yet was her name.
So she's telling me this. I was like, wow, that is crazy. I'm sorry, my name is Isaiah. What is your name? And she says, my name is Sarah. And I just went, oh, wow. That's wild. And she says, well, you said you're from Michigan too. What brought you to Nashville? Did you just want to get away? And I said, no. I moved here because I believe that God told me to move to Nashville. And I completely expected her to tuck and roll out of the car. I mean, it's not like we were going fast. But she asked more questions. She's like, how do you do that? And so I spent a good portion of the ride telling her about how to listen when you pray. Now we're getting close to the station, and I'm starting to get like a real strong sense of urgency. And I say, Sarah, I had no reason to pull into that parking lot. I didn't need to. It's just that I was pulling out of the hotel parking lot, and I felt very strongly that God wanted me to pull into that parking lot. And I believe that he wanted me to pull into that parking lot to help you. And I'm telling you, I don't think that it's a coincidence that a stranger just moved to town, happened to be there in an attitude of listening to God, willing to do crazy, seemingly irrational things, that this is the person that pulls in to help you out. I don't think that God wanted me to come here just to give you a ride. Maybe you should consider the possibility that God cares about you enough to send a stranger to come and help you. You can keep running if you want, but are you going to trust the God that sent a stranger to help you? She was afresh in tears at that point. Now, this part of the story, in hindsight, I now know that where I dropped her off was not the bus station. I didn't know any better. I was new to town. You know, this is before the advent of the smartphone. I don't know where stuff is. This was the Union Station Hotel from back when there were passenger trains. Nothing to do with the bus. The bus station was slightly less than a mile away. But I do wonder if Sarah maybe was just like, okay, I'm good. I let her use my phone to call her parents. And she was saying, I'm really sorry. I am coming home. I'm so sorry to scare you. And then she thanks me, and she goes back inside the hotel. And I get back in my car, and I start driving down to my storage unit, feeling like I've just done something really cool. Man, what a cool thing to have just happened. And I am so excited to have this story to share with people. And then a thought comes into my mind, you need to call her parents. It occurs to me, oh, right, she dialed their number on my phone. I have it in my call log. I could call her parents. But why in the world would I call her parents? Why would I do that? I don't want to do that. I remember thinking they're going to assume that I was the guy that she was staying with in Nashville. It's starting to feel a little messy now, God. And so I willfully ignore it. And I'm just going to go and move into a house for the first time in a long time. That's what I'm going to focus on. The thought starts to nag and it starts to get more insistent. I decide that if I'm going to have any peace, I have to call these people. So I stop the car and I call, and this woman answers. And I said, hello, my name is Isaiah. I just dropped your daughter off at the bus station. I just want to let you know that I think she is going to genuinely come home, and I think she's genuinely sorry for whatever pain she caused you. She asked me first if I was the guy that she'd been staying with, but I assured her that no, I'm just some guy. I just picked up your daughter. She was standing outside of a Waffle House and said she needed help. So that's what I did. And when I told her that, I genuinely thought that she was going to come home and that she was genuinely sorry, that we had a really good talk. The tone in this woman's voice changed, and this huge sense of relief comes into her voice. And she starts to tell me about all of the fear and the grief that they had been experiencing because they didn't know where their daughter was. And then she said, would you be willing to let us contact you back? I hate to admit it, but I did not want them to do that. I didn't want to get involved in this family's life. I just wanted to do my mitzvot, do my good deed, and then move along. I told her that I wasn't sure how long I was going to have this phone number, so I gave them my email address. And then a few days later, I got an email from Sarah.
This is Sarah's email, dated Thursday, October 24th, 2007. The title was Thank You, with a capitalized T and Y, followed by 3 exclamation points and a colon parenthesis smiley face. This is what Sarah said.
Isaiah, just wanted to say thank you for getting me to the Greyhound and your words of understanding and support. That meant the world to me and my family. I made it home safe finally, and I'm going to rehab tomorrow for a month. What a blessing. I feel that everything will work itself out, and I'll never forget you or your words. I will continue to work at recovery and to stay honest. The truth will set you free, and so far, I feel the chains that bound me getting lighter. I'm very interested in your book, so if you want to send me the title and where I can find it, that would be awesome. I will stay in touch and hope you will too. Take care. Keep me in your prayers as I will keep you in mine. It was a blessing meeting you. Thanks again. Staying strong, Sarah.
To which Isaiah replied,
Sarah, I'm glad I could help. And it's good to hear that you're determined to make some changes. I remember that step. It's a hard step. The name of my book is Stark Raving Obedience. You can order it through the website www.hearinggod.org. The old guy in the photograph is my dad. He does most of the teaching surrounding Stark Raving Obedience. Thank you for writing, Isaiah.
Isaiah claims God and 7 men told him, move to Nashville. That God directed him to live in a sticky extended stay hotel that reeked of urine, and that God prompted him to go to Waffle House. Because of all those promptings, a young woman in PJs escaped a drug dealer and received a quick, direct answer to her desperate prayer. Sarah's email is the type of email I'd expect from someone who still couldn't believe what happened. It gushed with 21 exclamation points, 2 colon parentheses happy faces, and 2 all caps words. Finally, and never, as in,
I made it home safe finally, and I'll never forget you or your words.
Isaiah's email was full of periods, proper punctuation, and directions on how to buy his book.
I sometimes regret being as aloof as I was, but at the same time, I feel like it was really important for me to remember that these are not stories. These are real people with lives and rich internal histories, and with more complex and complicated problems than we can ever assume. And God doesn't fix everything all at once overnight. That's not the way it works most of the time.
When Isaiah says that's not the way it works most of the time, he speaks from experience. He's witnessed multiple miracles in his life, but in 2020, he started therapy to heal from the trauma of physical assaults he experienced in elementary school. And although he believes in Jesus, has written a book about listening prayer with his dad, and still practices listening prayer on his own, currently, he doesn't attend church.
When I first moved to town, I met with a guy who was a pastor of a church in Franklin, and he was also my dad's college roommate. And so he was one of the few people that I knew in the area. So we got together for a cup of coffee, and he asked for my story, and I told him, and he said, well, I love your family, and I think that you're a really interesting guy, and I would love to have you at my church, but I got to be honest with you, I don't think that the people at my church would know what to do with you. And I said, what do you mean? What should people be doing with me? Wait, so I have to be a certain way to be a desirable member of your country club? Okay. Or like the time that I was involved in a church plant and I offered my services to be a part of the greeting team. And they said, we don't want people to meet you first.
After run-ins like this with church people, Isaiah and his wife tried to be resilient and eventually found a church and even worked alongside church leadership. But he found something different than he expected.
There was very little talk about the least of these. And if there was, it felt like marketing. It felt like we've got a couple of people of color in our body and look how diverse we are. The poor is great for charitable works because we have to show that we're a nonprofit and get tax exemption, but invite that poor person to your house for lunch after the Sunday meeting. It started to feel weird and icky and corporate.
Remember, Isaiah felt thoroughly chastised when God asked him,
is this something that you are going to live, or are you just going to talk about it when you're selling something?
In other words, Isaiah hates when his faith feels salesy, or when church leadership views people as units in a marketing demographic or cogs in a corporate church plant machine. He also hates when people in the church want to reach out to the poor, but won't invite that person over to Sunday lunch. But remember, he's the guy who genuinely helped a young woman escape a drug dealer. And he's also the guy who didn't want a fearful mother to call him again. Isaiah seems like the kind of guy who genuinely wrestles with contradictions in others and in himself. So it doesn't seem to surprise him some of the people he thought would celebrate this story with him didn't.
I barely ever talk about this. Most people inside of the church thought that it sounded crazy, even if it has a happy ending. People would express doubt or ask, furthering questions, and I was never offended by it. It was like, this stuff defies explanation.
So, some church people were skeptical, but Isaiah's dad had a different reaction.
My dad was impressed by it, and not in the sense that like, wow, you did such a good thing. I think that especially the end of that story, where I felt like I had to get involved in these people's lives, at least a little bit. I think that part of the story made an impression on my dad because, especially towards the end of his life, I think that was something that mattered to him. The people that he was ministering to or whatever, he was willing to get into their messy lives with them. I don't know how much of an influence I had on that directly, but I think that he was already kind of doing that. But I remember telling him that story and him kind of reaffirming for him that, yeah, these are real people. This isn't just a story to tell.
Isaiah's dad passed away on Christmas Day 2019 at his home. His obituary reads,
he will be remembered as a faith-filled husband, father, and grandfather. Ted was blessed with an energizing and contagious faith. He was devoted to teaching others the good news of Jesus Christ and sharing the power of listening prayer. He encouraged others to, quote, listen with the intent to obey, move past your wall of discomfort, because that's where the blessing lives. It's on the other side of obedience, unquote. He lived this truth until his last breath.
When I asked how writing the book with his dad and being around his dad's ministry affected Isaiah, this is what he said.
I think that it was beneficial for me during my time in the church because I think it gave me a certain boldness I didn't feel like I had to go through other people in order to access God. I felt perfectly comfortable sitting in quiet, trying to engage with the Spirit of God that way. I also think that it gave me a lot more compassion for other people, because instead of just living my life based solely out of my own wisdom, it sort of fostered an attitude of humility within me. Because if God loved these people enough to tell me to help them, then why wouldn't I also want to love these people? And very often they looked different than I did, or they had different socioeconomic histories than I did. I stopped seeing myself as the standard of what was right and good. And I just found a well of love for people, even if it felt messy, even if it felt uncomfortable. My dad knew that. And my dad told me before he died how proud of me he was.
Isaiah no longer believes some of the things he and his dad wrote in stark craving obedience. He does still believe that God speaks, though. And while he freely admitted that the crazy, miraculous stories he wrote about and the ones he personally experienced are still touch points for his faith in God, when he explained to me why he still wants a relationship with God, he doesn't tell me about those miracles. He tells me about his dad.
When I hear that voice in my head, it sounds fatherly, which I know is like imagery that's well worn in the Christian church, but in the sense that even if I was wrong, even if we didn't see eye to eye on stuff, even if I didn't have everything all figured out, my dad still wanted me to sit with him and talk to him. So even though I'm out of the church, I stop and listen.
Thanks for listening. If you like this story, hit follow or subscribe now. Also, please give our show a 5-star review on your podcast app. Doing so helps other people find it. And if you've heard a story you want to share with me, go to godoutloud.com now and hit record. It's easy and I'll listen. The theme song is written by me, Rob Vischer, and produced by the undiscovered songwriter Joe Fry. Thanks to Isaiah Kallman and Etta Woods for your time and interviews. If you love this show, show us some love and text this episode's link to your friends. Thanks again for listening to If you want to hear more stories of people who claim they heard God, go to godoutloud.com/donate. It takes time to interview, edit, and create this podcast. 60 to 80 hours per episode. 2 work weeks. That's like 80 episodes of The Chosen, or 47 times watching Frozen, or 10 nights of quality sleep without my kids to interrupt me. I could write 25 sonnets. I could cook 300 omelets, buy a food truck, feed a crowd, but I'd rather make God out loud. We're raising $20,000 to make season 3. Once we hit that goal, we'll start tracking down more stories, interviewing guests, and creating another 10 episodes for season 3. But in the meantime, we have 5 more episodes of season 2 for your listening pleasure. Thanks again for listening.
There was one time right before I started dating the woman that I married, I thought to myself, all right, is this the person? And I've decided to consult a list that I had written down at one point of my ideal partner. And I felt this strong sense that God wanted me to read that list again. So I dug it out of some notebook and started reading through the list. And I'm talking maybe 3 points into 10 points on this list. I realized this is so selfish. Everything on this list is about how it benefits me. Then the voice in my head said, you need to burn this list. It is not about another person being perfect before they can be in a relationship with you.
Hey there, I'm Paul Hastings, the host of Compelled. And just like the podcast that you just finished listening to, my show is part of the Proclaim Podcast Network. On every episode of Compelled, we use gripping, immersive storytelling to bring Christian testimonies to life. One of my favorite stories is episode 31 with Virginia Prodan. Virginia was a small, petite attorney in communist Romania during the 1980s, defending Christians in court. Her success angered the Romanian dictator, and he vowed that she would pay. One evening, Virginia was alone at her office when a man entered the room, closed the door, and pulled out a gun. He barked, "Shut up, sit down, I'm here to kill you." Virginia was face to face with a trained assassin. What happened next? Well, there's only one way to find out. Virginia's entire story is episode 31, entitled "He Came to Kill Me." Just search for Compelled on your podcast app or visit compelledpodcast.com. Again, that's compelledpodcast.com.